Hello friends, my name is JJ, and today we are once again going to talk about my most favorite show in the entire world, The Simpsons. As I'm sure you know, when it comes to Simpsons analysis, there is really only one opinion you ever hear, particularly from my generation. It used to be great, but now it sucks. Now, I don't agree with this take. I think the show is still pretty good, and the ratings certainly suggest it is still quite popular, certainly more popular than many of the other leading animated shows, which to me suggests that a more useful form of Simpsons analysis should seek to understand what has made the show such a hit for over 30 straight years, and what sort of lessons it might be able to teach the rest of us about creating a successful creative enterprise. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to take a look at the early days of The Simpsons and acknowledge the degree it spent a few years struggling to figure out exactly what kind of show it wanted to be. Since today we are all so used to the enormous fame of The Simpsons, it can be hard to remember that the show's success wasn't destined from the beginning. The show's creators had to work hard to win over audiences and keep them loyal. And for that reason, I think it can be fun to try to imagine what it would have been like to both make and watch The Simpsons in the early 1990s, when the show's ultimate destiny was still more open-ended and uncertain, in a way a show like, I don't know, Bless the Hearts is today. So what did The Simpsons do right? And just as importantly, what did they avoid doing wrong? The Simpsons, of course, began life as these very short filler cartoons shown between segments of a now long-forgotten 80s sketch comedy series called The Tracey Ullman Show, starring the British comedian Tracey Ullman, who actually still has a relatively modest acting career to this day. There was not much depth to these early cartoons, which were basically just simple gags involving this dysfunctional family with a stern father and 3 mischievous kids. But the people liked it, so in 1989, the sketches were spun off into a full-length animated sitcom for Fox. The Flintstones for the 90s was how creator Matt Groening pitched it. As is usually the case with a new show, the first season of The Simpsons comes off as fairly cautious and restrained, conservative even. Like the original Tracey Ullman shorts, the new series chronicled the adventures of a rude and crude American family. But obviously, to make things work in the 30-minute format, everybody's personalities had to be fleshed out a bit. So we get Bart, the bad boy with a conscience, Homer, the well-meaning paternalistic oaf, Marge, the family's nervous peacemaker, and Lisa, the precocious sermonizer. The original cartoon wackiness was toned down a fair amount to create something more conventional and sitcom-y. The initial 13 episodes featured tightly structured plots based around relatively conventional types of sitcom conflict, like tension in a marriage or unhappiness in school, that proceeded to end in sweet or even heartwarming moments where everybody learns a lesson and right triumphs over wrong. A lot of the show's early humor, in turn, just came from being introduced to this new version of the Simpsons family and seeing how they all behaved in different types of situations, not to mention getting to meet a few other members of the Simpsons extended universe. A great example of this is the season 1 episode Krusty Gets Busted, which is the one where Sideshow Bob frames Krusty for armed robbery. Much of the humor in this episode simply comes from audiences meeting these two characters for the first time. Krusty, who is this sort of pathetic, grasping children's entertainer, and his tortured sidekick, Sideshow Bob, who is clearly a more cultured and mature person, but also vain and entitled in a way that proves his undoing. The whole premise of this episode is basically just, hey, get a load of these guys. In 1990, The Simpsons was renewed for a second season, and it proved to be fairly similar to their first. A lot of plots based around introducing us to the personalities of the various characters and letting us see how they deal with different types of conflict and challenges, like when Homer pirates cable or when his cruel boss runs for governor. Now, I will confess that when I went back to watch some of these very old episodes, I was prepared to dislike them, but they're really not so bad. They're innocent and fun and have some legitimately clever and often very witty gags.
Do you really think you can win?
Sure, why not?
Oh, wow! All right! I always knew you had personality. The doctor said it was hyperactivity, but I knew better.
But at the same time, it is clearly a very different version of The Simpsons that relied on a novelty factor that was obviously unsustainable if the show was going to continue for much longer. And continue for much longer, it did. As The Simpsons began its third season in 1991, the plots and humor got noticeably more complex, and you got a sense that the writers were getting more comfortable with the characters and more interested in exploring their personalities in greater depth. So there's an episode where Bart becomes a good student and Lisa becomes a bad one, and one where Marge has a mini breakdown from being overworked, and a couple where Homer tries to be a better father to his kids by supporting their hobbies. Meanwhile, minor characters like Moe and Edna and Milhouse and Otto became more prominent and well-developed, while some early premises and characters that clearly weren't working, like Lisa's conflict with her music teacher or Bart's non-Milhouse friends, were quietly abandoned. The lesson learning aspect of the show remained, but there was often a lot more sarcasm, cynicism, and meta humor along the way. By this point, The Simpsons was on a roll. In 1992, the show aired its 4th season, and then a 5th in 1993. And it's in these 2 years when I think you can most clearly say that the tone and style of the show made its sharpest break from the ethos that guided it way back in 1989. At this point, a lot of the sweeter aspects of the show were ditched completely for a more consistently darker tone, with more vicious social commentary, reflecting a pretty nihilistic view of 90s era America. Episodes like Lisa the Beauty Queen, or Selma's Choice, or the one where Springfield legalizes gambling, or Homer becomes president of the Union, are not only less moralistic, but tend to feature open mockery of the idea that life even teaches moral lessons, and that right inevitably triumphs over wrong.
We didn't get any money, but Mr. Burns got what he wanted. Marge, I'm confused. Is this a happy ending or a sad ending?
It's an ending, that's enough.
The humor becomes noticeably darker too, with more gags based around gore or violence or other vile or shocking things. And the characters are often depicted as more twisted and unsettling. And why was this? Well, one thing you have to remember is that in those days, The Simpsons had a famously stable team of about a half-dozen core writers, and by this point they'd been writing Simpsons scripts for 3 straight years. By the time season 3 ended, there had already been nearly 60 episodes of The Simpsons produced. For comparison, that's as many episodes as the first 5 seasons of BoJack Horseman. And just as is the case when you spend a lot of time with real people, when you spend a lot of time with fictional people, certain things tend to happen. The first is you get a little bit bored with them, and maybe even a little resentful or irritated. And the second is that you get acclimatized to them. Because you've been around them for so long, you start to get a little bit numb to what once made them special. Basically the phenomenon that Bart describes here.
As a matter of fact, if you actually saw hell, you'd be so frightened you would die. Yes, Bart.
Wouldn't you eventually get used to it, like in a hot tub?
And looking back, I think it's easy to see this sort of attitude, whether consciously or not, clearly fueling a lot of the writing that went into season 4, and especially season 5 of The Simpsons. You get the impression the writers have grown a bit contemptuous of the characters, and as a result are having a bit of fun contorting them in bizarre or grotesque ways. They take personality traits that had grown predictable and cliched and really ratchet them up to bizarre levels, turning many characters into a kind of sarcastic parody of themselves. So it's like, what if Homer's constant snacking wasn't just a comical indulgence, but a serious medical condition on the brink of killing him? What if Mr. Burns wasn't just a cruel and nasty boss, but literally the most evil man in the world, actively trying to murder his own employees? What if he was in league with Satan, or actually was Satan?
I swear, Monty, you are the devil himself.
Who told you?
What if Smithers was not just a loyal henchman who would do anything for his boss, but literally sexually in love with Mr. Burns? What if the Flanders family weren't just nicer, better people than the Simpsons, but extreme fundamentalist Christians whose surface level niceness was actually just a symptom of how thoroughly they've been brainwashed by religion?
Catch me, Lord! Catch me! Wait!
What if Itchy and Scratchy weren't merely an excessively violent cartoon, but one that engaged in the most explicit, torturous body horror imaginable? What if Principal Skinner was not just a stern disciplinarian, but a semi-psychotic Vietnam vet? Also, what if he had some sort of twisted Norman Bates from Psycho-esque relationship with his overbearing mother?
I'm riding the bus today because Mother hid my car keys to punish me for talking to a woman on the phone. She was right to do it.
I often think that the climax of this era of The Simpsons was the 4th and 5th Halloween episodes, which are very bleak, disgusting, and in some ways quite mean-spirited towards the characters. Since anything goes in a Simpsons Halloween episode, it can be quite telling what the writers choose to do. Now, to be sure, I'm not necessarily saying that any of this was bad. Many episodes from this era are very funny. classics even. But I do think that when you go back and watch these particular seasons, allowing yourself to think about the period of the show's history in which they were made, it is possible to see them in quite a different light, to notice a style of writing that is maybe a little bored, a little nasty, a little apathetic, a little, dare I say it, Generation X. Now, in the same way seasons 1 and 2 represented a kind of unambitious squareness that couldn't go on forever, the show's dark, twisted shift in seasons 4 and 5, and maybe 6 as well, wasn't ultimately continued either. The Simpsons' destiny was not to wind up like South Park or Family Guy, two shows that came later and are much more consistently gross, dark, and political. Instead, as The Simpsons continued into the mid-90s, it sort of mellowed out. While the gentleness of the first season never returned, the writers did seem to get more genuinely affectionate towards the world of Springfield and its residents as time went on. After hitting a peak, which I would say came in the form of those Halloween episodes, plots stopped ratcheting everything up to maximum weirdness in order to make the show the most grotesque possible commentary on modern America. Instead, the writing became more playful and just sort of had fun with the self-contained Simpsons universe and its characters, many of whom mellowed out a fair bit too. Burns and Skinner became less sinister, Smithers just became a normal gay man, the Flanders became less creepy, and so on. A sort of happy middle ground was achieved between the more cliched writing of the early seasons and the nihilism of seasons 4 and 5. And as its era of experimentation drew to a close, the show gained an attractive consistency that was missing from the first few years, creating a solid foundation upon which the long-term popularity of the series would be built up until the present day. Now, obviously, some people will reject this whole summary. "What are you talking about?" they will say. "The reason I hate The Simpsons today is precisely because everything is so extreme and over the top." But I would say there is a difference between comedic extremism within boundaries, which is what I think The Simpsons does often engage in, and pure chaotic extremism, which I think is more descriptive of a show like Family Guy, and was something that The Simpsons was once teetering on the brink of. So here's an example. The character of Lisa is now basically set as a strident, liberal, bleeding heart activist type. This is a departure from her earliest depictions, when she was more mischievous, as well as more zen and philosophical, but it's also a characterization she's more or less fixed at now. From season to season, she might become a more or less extreme version of a crusading activist, but none of her fundamental personality traits are going to be abandoned or reimagined at this point. That basically stopped in the mid-90s and is something that differentiates the show from one like Family Guy, where the characters remain very ungrounded and behave in any random way that's necessary for the purpose of a gag. I think that writers of The Simpsons clearly like their characters in a way that writers of Family Guy do not, but also in a way that writers of The Simpsons didn't always. And that affection brings consistency and stability to the show's theme and setting, and that is clearly a major factor in The Simpsons' ability to keep pulling in audiences year after year. But it's also important to acknowledge that whatever we have today is the culmination of at least 5 early years of trial and error. So overall, I guess that the lesson is that experimentation is a crucial part of the creative process. When you're working on a long or ambitious project, don't be afraid to revisit your early assumptions or stretch your initial ideas in new and crazy directions, but also be aware when you are in danger of drifting too far, and don't be afraid to backtrack or compromise. So I hope you've enjoyed some of these recent videos, which I guess represent my efforts to dabble in media criticism. As I've said before, my realm of knowledge of scripted entertainment is quite limited, so I know I'm not the deepest analyst of concepts like story or character. But as Mr. Burns once said,
"You know, I'm no art critic, but I know what I hate."
So I'd be curious to know if my analysis of the first couple of seasons of The Simpsons rings true to you, and if you can think of any other show that perhaps went through a kind of similar trajectory, which is to say a show that changed a fair bit from its original premise, but also clearly never went as far in another direction as it could have. Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.